The Federal Reserve has raised interest rates 0.75% in its most aggressive increase since 1994 and signaled that more hikes are expected this year, as the central bank leans on higher borrowing costs to drive down demand since consumers can't buy as much and therefore slow inflation. Here's Fed Chairman Jerome Powell on the hike.
My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship, especially on those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we're strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective.
Axios reports that Americans will feel the hikes on credit card debt, auto loans, and home loans, which have gone up nearly double in just a year, from 3.1% to 6%. Yesterday, Powell reportedly told young people looking to buy homes that they need a reset, whatever that means. Meanwhile, Bloomberg reports the new hikes indicate a U.S. recession will likely hit by 2024. Whew, this generation, Robby, we're
great.
we're really the greatest generation insofar as we have endured nothing but recessions and setbacks our entire adult lives, which is why this idea of a reset is kind of silly. I don't know that we've ever been set as a whole sliver of the population.
Right. Yeah, we were probably just on either side of the 2008 crash when we were wrapping up college. That was miserable.
07, right here. I went into law school as Lehman Brothers crashed. I was dating a banker at Lehman Brothers at the time. He came up to visit me my 1L year the day of the crash and had to turn right back around and go back to New York. And was no longer working at Lehman Brothers because there was no Lehman Brothers to work at shortly after that. But look, I was reading a statistic that showed that under 50% of millennials are homeowners compared to 80% of baby boomers. We aren't hitting the same milestones that previous generations had. Throughout the campaign, one of Bernie's favorite statistics was that 40% of Americans couldn't meet a $400 emergency. And now I saw a report that the average cost of living per month has gone up over $400 per American. And that means that a lot of people, almost half the country, are finding themselves in a position right now where they cannot make ends meet. And yet we have this kind of casual attitude from the Fed and from leadership. I was going to say Democratic Party leadership, but honestly, I'm not seeing a lot of solutions anywhere that really are taking seriously the exigent needs of average working Americans.
Yeah, it's not good. I mean, look, the situation isn't as dire for young people everywhere in the whole country. There are still, affordable places, but a lot of the places young people want to live, cities, et cetera, have just become totally unaffordable. And that's a real problem. And now that's often where the best job opportunities are. Yeah, I'm not blaming it. I choose to live in a city. I want to live in a city. I get I'm not shaming that choice at all. It's one that applies to me. And trying to buy a home here would be terrifyingly expensive.
Well, even across the whole country, another statistic, I end up talking about some of this in my radar. That's why they're so easily coming to my head right now. But I think it's that in only 7% of counties in the United States can a full-time worker at a minimum wage salary afford a one-bedroom apartment. Mm-hmm. So this isn't just a New York City, San Francisco kind of coastal elite issue. Even if you do choose to work in other parts of the country.
Say the statistic again?
In only 7% of counties can working a full-time job at a minimum wage salary get you a one-bedroom apartment. And you might think, well, why are you working at a minimum wage salary? The average minimum wage worker is not some kid who you might think doesn't need to have an apartment on their own. It's a 35-year-old woman.
You got to get married.
It's hard out here, Robby. It's hard out here. But I think that is potentially, I would like a world where people felt like it was easier to get married if that's what they want to do. Certainly, a lot of single people are lamenting the fact that it feels almost necessary. There's this coercive pressure to marry anybody, because otherwise you can't survive. But we also don't have policies that are making those kinds of choices the easiest, especially when you look at the interest rates on home ownership and things going up.
We could build more houses. Building more houses would be great.
I think that would be great.
Build a lot more houses. Look, the economic situation is dire. This is a clear signal that things are the interest rate raise, we're headed for a recession, right? We're just going to end up eventually in a recession.
Yeah. Well, I am curious from a libertarian perspective, what is the party line, as it were, for moments like this where there is this tinkering that's being pursued by the Federal Reserve. It's not clear how effective it actually is. I've talked to a lot of economists that say that they do these things, they throw spaghetti at the wall and they see what sticks, but honestly, there's not a lot that can be done there. I mean, is there a different kind of approach to trying to bring down inflation, or at least, smoothing the effects on the population that you would adopt, or is it kind of a laissez-faire approach there?
Well, it's a laissez-faire approach. I am by no means an expert on the economic side of libertarian thinking, but the philosophy tends to be that when you have a bad economy, what you're seeing is basically the hangover. Like the reckless behavior already happened, and you almost have to let itself play out, and you should not get yourself in that situation again. But trying to do all this tinkering, like you said, to try to fix it, like it's too late. We already put ourselves in this situation with, whatever bad policies
COVID?
There were.
Supply chain issues?
Well, right. Some of it is not.
The war in Ukraine?
Well, some of this is not preventable, but some of this were policy choices that ought to have been different. Sure. We should have been manufacturing but they
more.
We already did it, and now we're going to
yeah.
suffer the consequences for doing it, is what I'm saying.
Well, Representative Briahna wrote an op-ed, I believe it was last week, talking about how some interventions that he would like to see, including stopping oil exports, only exporting to the extent that we exchange for our oil for oil that we aren't able to refine here but has already been refined overseas, and basically adopting a financial policy called smoothing, where you buy oil at lows so that you can try to even out the price fluctuations that people are experiencing at the pump, even if you can't bring it down substantially overall. And a lot of conservatives were very critical of this, saying you're only going to drive up inflation by buying at lows, et cetera, et cetera. And his point was like, look, we have to do something, not only because it's an election year, but because people want to see that you're making some kind of effort to ease their burden in their day-to-day living. I mean, what do you make of that?
I mean, I think the answer is we need to engage in more trade, end tariffs, and protective subsidies for certain industries. That more, products coming in, more going, that will bring down the cost of things. And when the government tries to say, even that we keep going back to the baby formula shortage, but right, there's tariffs on certain products. It's not, just let the market work it out. If on that level, the market, there can be downsides, but one of the good sides is that you tend to have the prices of things go down when you don't have a lot of rules for what people can buy and sell.
I appreciate that, and I'm not an expert on what's going on with tariffs, but I'm not ideologically opposed to that in the least. But in this case, it does seem to be beside the point when the supply issues aren't because of pricing, but because there was literally a pandemic that affected what's going on in ports across the country. Much of China is still shut down. Our ports in California
some of that is policy.
What's
that policy? Is it the Mann Act? No, that's the sex trafficking one. What's the one that forces ships have to dock in Puerto Rico or something first? You know what I'm talking about?
I know, I'm
There's
sorry.
an absolute. Okay, we got to talk about that later. I can't remember what the name of my colleagues at Reason would kill me for not remembering off the top of my head what it's called, but it vastly makes more difficult shipping on the Atlantic side because of where you have to stop in certain ports.
So much of the conversation again has been
But
about what's happening in LA, what's happening
supply chain
in California
issue.
ports. And Pete Buttigieg and Joe Biden have been talking about, the staffing changes that they tried to make early in the pandemic to try to make sure that, they don't have the same kind of burdens at the ports. The focus has been, as I've been following this story,
the Jones Act
on the West Coast port. So I'm not disputing whatever is happening in Puerto Rico, but the stories that we're getting is that there are these structural issues that, to your point, are in place because we've made decisions about how to structure our shipping industry that are bad, and we're reaping the consequences of them now. But again, that doesn't say much about what we should be doing short term. And Rokano, I interviewed him on my podcast recently, and he was very forthcoming about the fact that there, in many cases, isn't a lot we can do. If we were to drill more oil, there's a 5-year perspective on that. It would take a lot to build green energy. It would take years and years and years to do a lot of these things we should have been doing for a very long time. But that being said, we can't just sit on our laurels and tell the American people we're up the creek without a paddle. You have to do something. And I'm just curious whether or not there are some conservatives who feel the same way, and what, if anything, different they would be proposing if they were the ones in office right
permanently
now getting
repeal
judged for all
the
of
Jones
the
Act,
going on.
an obscure 1920 regulation that requires that goods shipped from one American port to another be transported on a ship that is American-built, American-owned, and crewed by U.S. citizens or permanent residents. I got it backward. It actually massively screws Puerto Rico, and was waived for a small period when Puerto Rico was going through all its troubles a few years ago. But then they brought it right back. It's very dumb. So.
Interesting. Robby says, we don't need American ships. American made, not for me.
I do feel that way. I know that makes people mad, but I'm not a buy American and hire American.
Well, look, it sounds like that's a future radar, and I look forward to hearing it, Robby.
Low prices, that's what I'm about.
But first, I will hear
First,
today's
I'll be hearing
radar.
about your radar. Today's radar is yours,
Okay.
and I am looking forward to that.
All right.